This is My Taste is Better Than Yours, the manga podcast where Guardian Enzel and I, Samu, discuss some of our favourite series and figure out, is my taste better than yours? Hello again, everyone. It's Samu here, and we've finally reached the point. We have got and caught up with Hunter x Hunter in our discussions of story arcs, and we're here at the Succession contest. Enzo, it's been a journey. Maybe we thought that we'd get another batch by now to go off of, but this is the arc that never ends, it feels like. So we're here to discuss what we have of it so far. And I think it's going to be maybe, correct me if I think I'm wrong, maybe our most disagreed discussion as well.
Could be. I too felt we would probably have gotten another round by now. It is what it is, and cumulatively, it's still a fair bit of stuff to talk about. So,
Indeed, we have lots to discuss actually. So much so that we're going to do another two-parter, just like we did with Chimera Ant arc. And hopefully, as the time of us recording this, it seems like Hunter x Hunter is going to come back shortly. Fingers crossed, let's see. But for now, let's discuss what we have. So this is the Succession contest. Some people call it the Succession War arc. This is everything post the 2011 anime. And this has been publishing since 2012 and it's ongoing. So yeah, wow, 13-ish years now. So yeah, I feel like from a lot of people who even got into the series at 2011, the Succession Contest arc is like their only experience with the series, with the manga at least. So we touched on it last episode, but that could have been the ending of the series in some ways. So this does sort of feel like a refresh or like a different approach. And the premise here is the Zodiacs, who are introduced to last arc, get quite caught off guard when King Nasabi of the Kakin Empire makes an announcement that he's going to be going into the Dark Continent, the very place that Ging mentioned to Gon, and drops that hint of like, oh wait, you thought this was the story? No, there is so much more potentially to go from there. And who is making that voyage or leading that voyage, but beyond Netero, the son of late Isaac Netero, who again we did not know existed. So the V5 contract the Hunter Association to hunt beyond. Things change quite quickly, and in typical Takashi fashion with complicated politics, Kakin is folded in and it becomes the V6 now. And then it turns out that the hunters have to get involved with this departure for the Dark Continent. This was, I think, for a time considered the Dark Continent arc, but we are not there yet. This is merely the journey to get to there, which is very fitting for a series like Hunter x Hunter, where it very much is the journey getting to the destinations. But the main premise of this arc, the Succession Contest, is on this very boat, the Black Whale. We have this plan to find who succeeds his throne. We have the 14 princes of the Kakin Empire, and in this case, prince is gender neutral term, so men and women of various ages. And with them, we have the various mafia families of the Kakin Empire on board, sponsors and others who are there to like further their own goals. Organizations and group we are familiar with and new to. Kurapika has just joined the Zodiacs, and he is there in part because the fourth prince of the Kakin Empire, Suraidnik, who I'll call Seri because that's his like cute little name because he's a cute little guy. He wants to hunt him down because he has some scarlet eyes from his clan. So Kurapika, at least, he has a mission and a reason for being there, but he has a very personal vendetta that he wants to achieve in being there. So he has double mission in that front. On the ship itself, you have various levels and all these characters and all these storylines, and God, it's Togashi. I've said this before. This is Togashi at his most Togashi. Enzo, do you think we're going to get into obviously various different storylines, things that work for us, maybe it's things that maybe don't work as well, or that aren't our favorites or your favorites? Spoiler. But going into just general impressions of this arc, maybe a good question for me to ask you, along with just your feelings of it, where it sits within the Hunter x Hunter world. Are you in line with the thinking that Togashi crosses the line into walls of text too often with this arc, with this everything post Chimera and the election arc?
yes. But with a caveat, that a wall of text from him is still better than most, non walls of text from most mangaka. So I'm not against the wall of text thing. I do think this gets excessive at times. As far as the arc itself is concerned, as you said, this is at this point you have to view it as the prequel to the Dark Continent arc. So this isn't even really the main arc. I've kind of found that for me, the way I've long struggled to come to grips as a diehard Hunter x Hunter fan to come to grips with Succession Contest and how I felt about it. And in the end, I think what works best for me is if I think about this as the Hunter x Hunter spinoff, and because as we said in our last Hunter x Hunter episode, really the election arc ended Hunter x Hunter in what would have been a very satisfying and elegiac way. It almost felt like a benediction to it, and it felt like an ending. And for me, going off into an interesting but ultimately intellectually more than emotionally interesting, uh, you know, sort of a different direction that he's taken the series, I find it works better if I compartmentalize and I think, okay, he finished Hunter x Hunter. It was great. Now he's doing a spin-off and it's set in the Hunter x Hunter universe with some of the Hunter x Hunter characters crossing over. That's how it works best for me to think of it in those terms. And I have a lot of experience with spin-offs over the course of my anime and manga life. Some of it extremely positive, some of it less positive. And I find that a lot of my spin-off experiences kind of call to mind experiences I've had when reading this arc. Obviously, this is not the first time this has ever been said about Hunter x Hunter. With Togashi, it would work better if it were, coming 45, 50 chapters a year, if it were happening on a real regular basis where we could follow what was happening and the massive, massive armies, hordes of characters and storylines and subplots would be easier to keep straight and easier to keep a sense of connection to if we didn't have to wait, 8, 10 months between batches of chapters, sometimes longer. But then again, how did the people feel when Chimera Ant was going into those massive hiatuses a lot longer than 8 to 10 months in the middle of, ridiculous cliffhangers? So it's not like this is a new experience that's unique to Succession arc. That's my view on it.
And you saying that is interesting because there are some exceptions to what I'm going to say. I would say Greed Island is one because that was a concept that was brought up quite a bit before the Greed Island arc happened. And then I do also think, for obvious reasons, the election arc bleeds. The Chimera Ant arc and the election arc bleed into each other in a way that narratively makes sense. But I would argue Hunter x Hunter is a series where Togashi resets every arc, What was the Heavens Arena before it got introduced? Like, what was York New City? Like, what was Chimera Ant? I think a lot of people felt like Chimera Ant was a detour in the wrong direction when it was coming out. And I see similar things happening with Succession Contest. So I don't disagree that it feels like a spin-off, but I think Togashi likes to spin everything, and this is just his next exercise in where he can take a different direction for the story and different cast of characters and concepts that he wants to explore, which in some ways do feel quite removed from what has come before. But that happened with Chimera Ant arc, and we both agree it's incredible. And I genuinely do believe that this has potential to be at that level as well. I do have a lot of affection for this arc. You dropped the word intellectual. I think this is for Togashi maybe more of an intellectual exercise than an emotional one in some ways, at least at this point of what we're seeing in the narrative. And that just tickles my brain. That's another part where we have slightly different tastes, even though we do like largely the same things. This approach, to me, feels like a natural growth of Togashi in the last few arcs, where he clearly is more interested in going. I can see your point on that, but I would just maybe my argument would be in so many ways Hunter x Hunter feels like a spin off of itself all the time, and I do think so. And you can disagree on this. This has maybe been my assessment. Maybe the answer is that you're not feeling this arc. This doesn't work for you on the same level as some of your favorites narratively. But I do think maybe some part of it is to do with, like you've admitted before, you've said that you prefer the anime. You have a closer fondness with the anime, having experienced that. I feel like maybe it's a mixture of that, and this is now reading it in the manga. You've got all these hiatuses which do make the experience quite difficult when you can't retain all the information which Togashi is cramming into the pages. So I do wonder if when this is like taken in its totality, if it ever does get adapted, will it be regarded as just as great as everything else before it? I really do think it would be. I'm at the point where I'm confident, and I feel like someone like you would be able to see how it all comes together in a way that maybe when we're doing it 10 batches at a time isn't really apparent. I find it very rewarding because I do actually reread it pretty much every time that a hiatus it comes from hiatus. So I get everything lodged in my brain, and it continues and it flows as it always has with his hiatuses. He doesn't. He it's a very random chapter in terms of like where the narrative is. Like he will end at like 400, 410. Like he has a stopping point by this point that he always stops at, but he will not change the narrative for the point that he's going to pause at. So like once you take it in its totality, like I have 4 or 5 times at this point, and many times I've reread it, I think there's something really great here.
I just feel like to address the question of reinvention every arc, I feel there is a spine, a continuity running through all of the arcs building up to this arc that connects them in a way that this arc is not connected to them. This feels more like a completely different animal than any of the other arcs. Even Chimera Ant did to the arcs that came before it, at least to me. And you might just dismiss that as saying, "Oh, it's because Gon and Killua were in all those arcs and they're not in this one." And I don't totally dismiss that as being a relevant factor, but I always feel like Togashi is setting up arcs, next arc after next. He's always setting those up in the current arc. He's always doing things to set up, like so that when those arcs come, you feel like, okay, I see where he was laying the groundwork for this. I feel that less with Succession Contest than I did with any of the arcs that came before it. So I don't think I agree in this concept that he basically is always doing a spin-off every time he does a new arc, because I feel like those arcs have a continuity to them that I think this arc does not have. That's just my take on it. And that's not the right take. It's just my take. And so anyone who sees it differently, that's completely valid. To me, it doesn't feel connected. I don't feel the connective tissue the same way that I did with every arc that came before it. And I don't think it comes down to Gon and Killua. I think there's something more to it than that. But that, again, horses for courses. Everybody's going to have a different view on that.
I can see that from the perspective of the last arc did feel quite conclusive. It did feel like it came around for a lot of characters, in particular Gon and Killua, and it felt like it could have been the ending. So yes, I agree in that sense that Election Arc could have been the ending of the series in a way that none of the other arcs really could have. But I think if someone who experienced the latter part of Chimera Ant and its reception from various angles, I see the similarities there. So I'm not. Yeah, I feel like this is not the first time this has happened. I think that's where my head is at. But yes, it is a very big arc, very dense. So dense that we've like even said ourselves that. Do we think Togashi remembers all these characters' names, or does he have to study for his own series whenever he returns? I think it probably is the latter. I think.
I'm sure of it.
He's created one hell of a beast in this. I think about it sometimes. You can say if you can name something otherwise, but I just don't know if there's a story arc in manga that is like this, that is this in depth and detailed and broad and ever expanding. There's just nothing else that really I can pinpoint is quite like what we're getting with
No,
Succession Contest.
no, I can't point to anything that I say this is reminiscent of. And in that sense, I couldn't have said that with Chimera Ant either. So it does have that in common. Maybe even
Sure.
more so than Chimera Ant, though. It's just that it doesn't seem to be following any sort of a traditional narrative structure that an arc would. There's no arc to the arc. It's just one
Yeah.
thing happening after another, and it's like the physicists say the universe expands to a certain point and it expands for billions and billions and billions and billions of years, and then it starts to contract and like a rubber band, you might say, or whatever. And I think fiction tends to be the same way. Long series, they build, they build, they build, they world build, they expand, and then at some point they start to contract, and you start to get into explanation, and you starting to get into resolution, and you don't have any sense with Succession Arc that expand. At least I don't have any sense with Succession Arc that expansion has stopped yet. I feel like we're still, like 40% in the expansion phase before we even start the contraction phase. Part of the challenge for me, which is a fascinating challenge, is I don't feel as if I know where he's going with it. I don't feel like I know necessarily ultimately what the point of it is. I did have that sense with Chimera Ant. Now, to be fair, some of what I had that sense of with Chimera Ant turned out to be wrong, and he was faking me out. But I did, at least during the process, I had some idea like, okay, I see the arc of this story. I see where he's going with it. And I don't see that with Succession arc. So it may be there and I'm just not seeing it, but I'm not seeing it.
We're at 71 chapters for this arc so far.
Mm.
Like 71 chapters into Chimera Ant. We had not reached the palace invasion. Komugi and Meruem are playing their game of Gungi, and there is like the minor preparations happening for the cast to get involved in the invasion. So yeah, you in the same way, we're still in this expansion stage. We have not seen the contraction and where all the follow through is going to come. And it does seem like with every batch, Togashi introduces more layers and complications for himself narratively that even puts, if anyone's familiar with George R. R. Martin, the Miranese knot that he would always talk about. Looking at the Miranese knot and then looking at Succession Contest, I'm like, Togashi's outdone you there, George. I think the sheer scope that we're getting here is massive. So when we're talking about this arc, obviously we don't have the knowledge of where it's all going to come to. Let's try and break it down in some sections to make some sense of this arc. First angle that we can look at it is we have the Zodiacs and the Expedition who were introduced to, and this is in like the beginning stages of this arc. Like I mentioned, Kurapika and Leorio, they are in the Zodiacs, and then we have like Beyond Netero being introduced and them being involved in this mission. But this is all kind of being established as stuff that's going to happen in the Dark Continent. So for very much for them, this is like a means to an end to get to this point. This is Kurapika's arc, 100%, even more than York knew. And then I think Leorio maybe has some potential to get brought in a more substantive degree. But we still have to wait and see how it goes from there. So yes, they are on board this ship. Others who are on board this ship who we have not seen since the ship took off, but we did see quite a bit beforehand, is Ging and Pariston. So they had this little like story out, this little side quest before the ship took off, where Pariston, he was elected chairman and then he gave up the job after mere seconds, and then Ging kind of went after him, and it continues that banter, this balance that they have with each other, their like but also dislike they have. Yeah, the very early stages of this arc, I think, were when people were like, okay, this is the Dark Continent arc. This is going to be like these. We're setting up these things for then to see what these characters are going to get involved with it. They have been kind of shelved for the time being, But yes, I don't know if you can cast your mind back to this section. Essentially, it's Ging joining Pariston's gang that he has with Bjorn Netero, and Pariston has his army of Chimera Ants that he can potentially use whenever he wants. But we get some interesting drops of lore, like Gon Freecss, who is the author of The Journey of the New World. But there is at least some connection of the Freecss name going into this or beyond this arc. And yeah, we see this like back and forth of Ging and Pariston of them deciding who's going to be the leader of this group. And in typical Togashi fashion, there is a sort of an anticlimax there because we have this invasion of these soldiers who are brought in, and but Ging clocks that this is all a scheme by Pariston to essentially test everything. And he revealed one of the most telling lines, I think, for Pariston is when he says, "I feel happiness when people hate me, and I feel compelled to hurt things that are dear to me." We touched on him, like the concept of him as a villain, less so in the previous arc, but it's moments like that and like just understanding his psyche where I'm like, in the future of the series, with these acts that he has, I don't know where we're going with Power Stone, but there is definitely something sinister to him. So yeah, do you have any thoughts on this very early stage of the arc pre boat?
Yeah, it's like that was I presume it was Togashi's intention to plant the seeds there and then not do anything with it for a very long time. I feel like that was like a little bit of the Dark Continent arc previewed at the beginning of the Succession arc. That's kind of what it felt like to me. And you know, a little fan servicey too, with Ging and Pariston going at it in their kind of odd couple way. But so yes, it feels like they were kind of in their own story, and it's like they still are in their own story, and their story isn't really interacting with the other story yet. And if things go on long enough, eventually it will, but it's probably going to be a long time yet before we ever get back to those two being main players again, I think.
Yeah, and even knowing that they're on board or they're along for the ride, even if not involved in the succession contest, like Togashi could play his card in the next 10 batches and be like, "Oh wait, Parston and gang wake up and they figure out this happened." We have like yet another layer of how things can potentially get messy.
We
Um,
do, but I get the feeling that they don't care that much, and they're just kind of like let these children have their little fun and squabble. We've got bigger
if
fish to
they
fry. That's the vibe I get.
if they even are aware that it's happening as well.
If they are aware, but they probably are, as smart as they are.
So one more thing tangential to Gang. Let's talk about his son, Gon. Has anyone seen Gon? No, I don't think anyone's seen him. He'll pop up on a cover of Weekly Shonen Jump and a volume in which he is not present in the manga. But Gon is largely missing for this arc, like you touched on, and Killua is missing entirely. But we do actually get a chapter, a few moments of Gon back on Whale Island. Um, and then he was like on a phone call with Ging, and then he's back home. When you think back on that, Enzo, are you like, I long for the day where we cut back to go on Whale Island? I think the chapter where that happens again will be when you celebrate.
I think it's funny that when they did put Gone on the cover of the most recent volume, they actually put a disclaimer on there saying, "Note that Gon Freecss does not appear in any of the chapters in this volume," which is the first time I've ever seen that on a volume cover. Um, you know, I would like to see some acknowledgement of it and how he's doing back home. If I don't really care so much if it's like if like a few pages here and there, like we got the last time. It's like, oh, by the way, he is still alive. This is what he's doing. He's going to school. He's having trouble with physics or whatever it is. It's that's cute. It's kind of irrelevant in the big picture. If he were to do kind of like a check-in arc, like we had two check-in arcs here that are kind of divorced from the main storyline, which I guess we'll probably talk about. But if he were to do like an actual series of chapters, like 6 or 8 chapters or whatever, where we kind of take a detour and go back to Whale Island and see how he's dealing with his lack of nen and how what he's doing to try to regain it and all those other things, and maybe he's having some kind of a issue that he has to deal with, using his wiles without having his nen ability. Is he still as sharp a kid as he was, or has some of his other abilities been dulled when he relied on nen? I think that could be interesting if he were to treat that in the same way he treated the insets that he did within those two other situations. If it's just going to be a couple pages, yeah, I'd like to see it. It'd be fun, but it's not going to make a big impact for me either way if that's all it is.
Yeah, I wouldn't be shocked if he's saving that for the arc after this. Maybe. I had feelings about whether the Dark Continent, as we people are imagining, is actually going to happen. But yeah, like we said, I think Gon, Gyro, potentially Killua being brought into the mix again. I think that will be its own self-contained story. Hopefully, potentially. Takashi literally
Hopefully,
had the narrator tell us that it's going to happen at some point in some
right.
shape or form. So yes, I think Gon is not over for now, but Gon is not relevant to the boat. But before we jump on the boat, there's one more thing, and this is like shifting another view, another group involved with this, which is Hisoka, Chrollo, Phantom Troupe, that whole aspect of it. They are also on the boat, but before that, we have one of maybe could be argued one of the most loved by fans, like one of with that stretch that we get at Heaven's Arena, which is very much out of nowhere,
Very
where
much.
we have you said it before, one of the most fan servicey sections of the story, which is Hisoka versus Chrollo. They have their rematch. They have the confrontation that Hisoka was longing for way back in York New City. Um, yes, I have feelings about this, so I'll let you take it away on this stretch of this fight that they have. What's your feeling on it?
Well, I think it's great, and I think it would make a great OVA. You know, if because it's going to be a long time before there's any realistic possibility of more anime seasons because the Succession arc. I mean, I don't think they would to start adapting Succession arc uh, when it's clearly in this embryonic stage like this. Even though there are enough chapters, if they wanted to do a season, they could. But you could do a standalone OVA of the Hisoka Chrollo Heaven's Arena battle, and I think people would eat that up. And I think we've seen that every time something new, Hunter x Hunter remarkably has not lost any of its commercial firepower. Every time there's a new volume, it sells over 1 million copies. Every time you go to Jump Festa, Hunter x Hunter still has a big presence there. Every time you go to an animate or whatever, there's a Hunter x Hunter section of like Hunter x Hunter keychains and T-shirts. There's the series. Anything associated with Hunter x Hunter is still commercially viable. It's still insanely popular. I would love to see them do. I would love to see them do an OVA of the Heaven's Arena bit because it is great and it's pure fan service. And I say Jimmy crack corn and I don't care. I mean, give me that fan service. I loved it. I don't think it's coincidental that to me the most engaging sections of the arc are those two insets that I was talking about, which are connected in that sense. One of them is that, and the other one is the flashback sequences where we get back to the childhood of the Phantom Troupe, which were also great chapters. And those were really the only sections of the arc that kind of bridged the gap between being emotionally engaged and being intellectually engaged. So yeah, I think that section is great. I don't think that Togashi goes down this road of pure fan service all that often. So when he does do it, obviously people get very excited, and I think with good reason. As fan service goes, it doesn't get much better than that. That's my take on it.
My take is an interesting one. This is a very bold thing to say, but again, some people are more skeptical of this arc, but still love this section. This is my least favorite part of the arc by a fair bit. I think it's actually, if I am not often critical of Tagashi, but I think it's actually, in my opinion, not a very well done fight. I think it's too verbose in ways that it doesn't need to be. I think it was personally for me quite hard to follow, which is funny because people find the more like text-heavy stuff, stuff happening on the boat, hard to follow, which I'm way more on board with. I think yes, it probably would benefit with being adapted, because I just felt it cluttered on the page in a way that I didn't really have before with Hunter x Hunter, particularly in these like heavy, more action in these fights that we see. So yeah, I still like it, and I still think it's a very fun. It's very fun matchup to see, even considering how random it is. And I think what it actually establishes from that point onward is, for me, way more interesting. Because it leads on to this. Well, first of all, the resolution of that fight is that Chrollo wins, so Hisoka dies, and he kind of does properly die, and there is a moment where you're like, wait, this is actually happening, and then no, we get post-mortem Nen being revealed as a concept, and of course Hisoka's not going to die. What is Hunter x Hunter without Hisoka? And that sets him on this quest mission to take proper revenge now on the Phantom Troupe, which he begins almost immediately by taking out two members in pretty brutal ways. And that, I think, establishes why, in part, the Phantom Troupe are on this boat as well. They're on the boat because there's a potential to find riches, and in a very like obvious way for that front. But Chrollo as well is in a very dark place because of what happened with what Hisoka is doing. So I think it's established very well this conflict that is also happening amidst this succession contest. And I think it does help. Like you touched on, that you feel more emotional connection to this section. I think that it just goes because these are characters we are much more familiar with. Having them included within this arc, I think, does help a lot to keep readers invested, especially when they're thrown into the mix. But yeah, I have a few more thoughts. But yeah, do you actually think that, here's my question, another question, if we're going to see that resolved in this arc, who do you think is going to win?
I think both of them are too essential to have one of them wipe out the other. I really believe that. I think they're too integral to the dynamic of the fabric of the series to have one of them just flat out win and take out the other. If one of them was going to win, I think it would be Hisoka. But I don't think one of them is going to win.
I think where I'm at is, I do think this arc could be the resolution of the Phantom Troupe as a group. I think Chrollo is going down a very dark path of how everything's affecting him, and my prediction of where things are going to go is Hisoka is going to chopping off these numbers one by one. He's going to lower it down. Chrollo is going to get in a very dark place, and maybe we'll get to a point where they take each other out. Maybe not, but then if I was to place a bet, I would say Hisoka will edge out, because if we are ever going to return to Gon, I think we need Hisoka there. I think Hisoka needs to be there to see Gon return to his former or new glory.
Yeah, there's an unfinished business between Hisoka and Gon, and it's not just unfinished business, but it's unfinished business that's integral to the themes of the series. That if this is not just a spin-off series, if Hunter x Hunter still exists as an entity, and we have the whole, and as you said, we have to separate Togashi's intentions from reality here. But for the purposes of this discussion, we're talking about his intentions. Clearly, with the whole Gyro situation, he's not done with Gon. It has to go there in the end, or it had to have been intended at some point to go there in the end. And if indeed, that part of the series still exists, I think Hisoka is too much a part of Gon's story for him not to be there when we get back to it. Whether that actually happens is a separate question that we can't answer because we just don't know. But whether it was intended to happen, yes, I think it was intended to happen. So if in fact there's going to be any taking out here, I think Hisoka is going to be the one ultimately standing when it's all said and done. But I don't necessarily see it ending with him taking out the troupe and Chrollo. It could. I don't see it happening. As far as them taking him out, I definitely don't see that happening. I think where we got with the Heavens Arena situation is as close as where we're going to get.
Yeah, that was Hisoka's loss, so this is his chance to gain. I think, against them.
And I think the problem with Hisoka is, even when dealing with the Phantom Troupe, he's always got one more level of depravity that he can go to, that like this internal chess game where they can go one boom 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 boom, and someone thinks they finally got the leg up on him, but he's always got one more, and he's always got one more level that he can go to than everybody else in more senses than one. And I think that's the problem here too. In the ultimately, he's always going to have that one extra level that he can go to that's going to leave him as the last man standing.
I think if I was to consider who is stronger, I think Chrollo personally is stronger than Hisoka. I think the Phantom Troupe as a collective should, in theory, be able to beat Hisoka. But I think by the very nature of the way Nen is set up and how Togashi plays things out and just how Hisoka sits in the story, like you say, he is willing to go to he's willing to go deep. He's willing to go down to the depths of hell in order to get what he wants. So I will be very, very curious to see how far he's going to go in that quest he has. One more thing on Hisoka. I don't know. Were you familiar much? You're probably not. Between hiatuses as involved in like fandom discussion as I am, but were you familiar with the fake Hisoka theory that was bubbling for a few years during this arc?
I've heard of it, but I never put much stock in, like I never saw anything that was convincing to me to make me say I got to check this out.
It was a funny one because it kind of got proven that there was a fake Hisoka. People were picking up there were just things that we saw him when he was on the boat that didn't feel correct 100%, and they just something felt off in his presentation. And it wasn't until this latest batch actually where we found out that in fact Bolonolonov from the Phantom Troupe was pretending to be Hisoka for a good while. And the first introduction we actually get to the real Hisoka, I believe, is chapter 405 of this latest batch, where he's playing like a card game and he's doing something completely different. And that threw people off, but also was like, oh, wait, this theory, maybe not in the way that some people were expecting it to play out, but yeah, that was a nice little thing that fans were picking up on to be like, our Hisoka wouldn't be acting like this. And I think we actually got a really, I think, the most genuinely insightful look at Hisoka as a character in that chapter. So yeah, I would recommend people go back to that if, especially before whenever the new batch comes, because we get quite like a rare introspective moment of how he views himself, what gets him off. Yeah, I think it was just like a very rare moment to see from his character. And now that we're seeing him for who he is proper on the arc, on the boat, we have one more chance that we're going to continue this revenge he has against the Phantom Troupe. You did touch on the flashback that we had for the Phantom Troupe as well, which I think everyone agrees was one of the best stretches of the arc. I think it was a much needed look at these characters who we didn't really understand the full picture of. Curious any thoughts you have, and maybe one in particular that does always stick out to me is, do you see a young Kurapika in the young Chrollo like we saw in that one
I
shot?
Yes, I can't remember if we've actually had this conversation before. Maybe we haven't, but I've always thought that there was an intentional parallel being drawn between the Kurapika backstory, which was actually written as a one shot in support of one of the movies, and then the effectively the Chrollo backstory one shot, if you want to call it that, which is kind of inserted in the middle of the succession arc. Absolutely, I was like, I feel that very strongly that he's drawing a parallel there, which is interesting, because in theory, at least, you could say that the if you don't believe the movies are canon, then is the Kurapika backstory canon? Well, I would say yes, because it was written by Togashi. What's the reason why he would draw that parallel? No, I think that's an interesting question in its own right, especially given Kurapika's revenge quest and how that factors into the players in the succession arc, which it most certainly does, in a very specific and direct way. So, Yes, I see that parallel. Absolutely, I see it. And just in more general terms, I thought I thought those chapters were really well done, really, really emotionally very powerful. And I think if you imagined uh, what a Phantom Troop, childhood story would be like, it may not have been how you imagined it would be like, but then once you saw it play out, you think, oh, why didn't I imagine it this way? This is exactly how it should have played out. So I feel like it was like a great burst of Togashi genius to give them this like perfect origin story that just is like a throwaway afterthought in the middle of a bigger story that like totally gives you a convincing and compelling introduction to where these weird and dangerous people came from. So yes, I think it's a very accomplished piece of work.
I think my thinking as well is, like I've said, I'm going into this with the expectation that this arc is potentially the end of the Phantom Troop as we know it. So what could feel random, I feel like feels like the most opportune moment to see this backstory. And we see so much more connections between them. You know, seeing Chrollo in his like pure state, going from like it's a very fun trope actually, like the weak, timid boy who is the ruler of these much more opposing intimidating people around him, but like the draw that he has to keep them all together. Yeah, I think it does so much in establishing their connections in a way that when I was rereading York New, I felt the Phantom Troop
Mm.
much more than I actually did the first time I read and watched York New City.
And might I also add, one of the things that it establishes that is again, once you go back to York New, it becomes much more apparent is this: there is a tier system in the Phantom Troop, the ones who are part of that core group from the olden days and the ones who are not. And Chrollo, I think there's a difference in the way the level of trust and the level of attachment that these people have to each other is different. There's a tier system. There's the ones who are part of it. There's like they're inner spiders and outer spiders, if you like, which is something that we kind of knew that, but we didn't really know to the extent to which that was a powerful influence in the group dynamic. And now I think that becomes much clearer now that we've had this story to really spell it out for us.
And I think it connects why in York New City Pakunoda had such a
Mm.
this like connection with him, with Chrollo in particular, because she's one of those ones that goes back to day one. So yeah, it was also very nice to just see the characters are no longer with us get some spotlight as well. And then one of my favorite like connections that I thought was really impactful to bringing it to the current boat situation is well, so much of that arc is framed around capturing the death and mutilation of Sarasa, who was part of this group and one of the closest people to Chrollo. And there we go. There's the mirror between him and Kurapika. I think sets him on this path of vengeance and like being driven so much by this event that's happened to close family that it like shifts his mental state. You see that what happened with Sarasa. You find out that the person who actually murdered her or like captured her, the human trafficking, was a man called Risnorth. And in the latest batch, you find out that he is one of the greatest entrepreneurs in the world who has just died, and there's a funeral procession happening on the boat itself because he is famous for rescuing unfortunate children. So there is like deep irony that connects. Just seeing that from the latest batch to the batch before, where we had that flashback, and the scenes of Chrollo when that was happening, who is already in this like very low state. More things that Takashi's piling on top that I think are just going to eventually, when the arc condenses, we're going to see, I think, some pretty deadly and consequential results for him in this group. And not even to mention that Kurapika doesn't know the Phantom Troop is there. He's not going to take kindly to that. You know, is there actually going to be a point where Kurapika is like, wait, who do I choose? Do I choose the Fourth Prince or do I choose the Phantom Troop? And where does does Kurapika get as lost in the moment as Chrollo is? Yeah, I think there's some genuinely really fascinating potential end of character arc stuff that can happen for lots of characters
Mhm.
involved.
Yes, I agree. I also think that there's a distinct possibility that Kurapika and Chrollo may get to a point where they realize that the other one is not really their enemy. I mean, at least not the enemy that matters. And to a certain extent, um, you could even see Kurapika saying, kind of almost like, I feel like he's been chasing a ghost in a way. That I don't see Kurapika versus Chrollo as being, or the troop as being like a final battle. I don't see that happening. Yeah, I don't see them being Kurapika's. We're on the black whale. I don't see the troop. I don't see Chrollo as Kurapika's white whale. I think in the end he's going to realize that he's been chasing the wrong enemy. I really feel that way. And we'll see how that plays out. We can talk about Kurapika and all the reasons to suspect that this could be a reckoning arc for him. He's been kind
Yeah.
of going down this path for a long time, but now he's kind of doing things that kind of make you think he's actively trying to push things in that direction. It's like he's ready to go out with a bang here. That's kind of what it feels like.
Yeah, I do feel like this arc could very well be the curtain call for quite a lot of characters. So we shall wait and see. But yes, we've discussed so much already, and we've not even got to the actual succession contest itself yet. That we shall save for part 2 of this discussion, which will be published next week. So, everyone, thank you for listening so far. Hope you've enjoyed. Stay tuned and see you for the next episode.